Good morning, everyone. I can see the room starting to fill up. Make yourselves comfortable, grab your cup of coffee, introduce yourself on the chat, and we'll get started very quickly. It's Sharon Avery from the Toronto Foundation, welcoming everyone into the room as they get themselves settled. It is Thursday morning, and I welcome you to say hello in the chat as per usual. For those of you that have been here before, if you're new, introduce yourself, represent an organization in Toronto, please don't hesitate to let us know who you are joining us from. Don't hesitate to answer questions. And the poll is open. We always like to know who has joined us today. And so please take a second. You see the red dot in your toolbar for polls. Tell us who's here. We'll get started in about 30 seconds. As the room fills up, we have a very full agenda today, and I think we better get started, but I invite everyone to introduce themselves. It's so great to see so many familiar faces introducing themselves in the chat. It is meant to be a warm and welcoming place, and I'm so glad that you have joined us for, if you can imagine, our 9th virtual gathering since the beginning of COVID over the last 3 months. I want to acknowledge it's been 2 weeks since we got together last, and it has been a month since we had a conversation about COVID and race. And I can't imagine how some folks that are on this call, or all of us, I hope, are feeling about the last 2 weeks. It has intensified our experience through this pandemic with a bigger conversation about race. But it is all connected, of course, to the issues of inequality. And that is really what we have been trying to focus on through these 9 gatherings, is the fact that the pandemic, which I think when it first started, we called the Great Leveler, but it's not. It's only increased our sense of inequality, not just in Toronto, across this country and around this world. And we're so grateful to those of you that have been joining us for all of these gatherings. This is a time for us to feel connected to each other, to talk to each other, to share what we're doing, and most importantly, to take some action. And so I'm really hoping that today is the same kind of conversation, because it's just clearly more important than ever that we not just talk about what we want to do, but we do something about the change we want to see in the world. So our conversation today, we have our speakers, and I'm so grateful to have Emmay, Tanya, Michael, and Steve, who I will introduce properly in a few minutes. As always, I want to express my gratitude to the First Peoples of this country. In our work in Toronto, that's the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. We recognize that colonialism has led to deep trauma for Indigenous communities, and I'm really particularly glad to have Tanya here to talk to us today about how integral the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the climate and the environment are. More Canadians are also reconciling this truth of colonialism when it comes to our country and systematic Black racism. The environment is not the first thing that comes to mind when multiple cities in the world are seeing protests against anti-Black racism, and we all continue to live through COVID-19. We are keenly aware that many of us are privileged not to have been hit as hard by COVID, and are starting to think about what's next and how we want to work toward an equitable recovery. It's a bit of a catch-22 in terms of what this underscores during the pandemic. those who are impoverished are left with less resources and capacity to go beyond survival, let alone to organize and demand better environmental policies. That trend is already playing out worldwide when it comes to global warming and the threat of more environmental refugees or deforestation or lack of accessible land and tree protection for residents in less developed countries. We also have a strong sense of how these threats are playing out in our very own city. We've been on a resilience journey with the City of Toronto for the last few years. And we know through our vital signs work and other research that the benefits of planting, for example, 10 more trees per city block are comparable to the positive health benefits of increasing the income of every household in that city block by $10,000. I'm going to say that one more time because that's a pretty powerful stat. And I know Michael on our panel today is going to want to reinforce that one. The benefits of planting 10 more trees per city block are comparable to the positive health effects of increasing the income of every household in that city block by $10,000. In 2013, Toronto had about 1/4 of forest cover, but the distribution of that forest cover is unequal in the city. As global warming gets worse, those who are already marginalized bear the brunt of extreme weather. And I know we had a little bit of extreme weather last night. We were a bit worried we wouldn't have everyone on our panel able to join us today. According to the city's Resilience Strategy Report, the overlap of climate risks and vulnerability in apartment towers represents the single most pressing, urgent priority for the city's resilience. There is evidence that on average, wealthier people in countries with more equality consume less, produce less waste, and emit less carbon. It seems that almost all aspects of the environment improve when economic equality is greater. What we know for sure is that Toronto is close to the topping of the chart of most unequal cities in Canada, and we need to better resource environmental efforts, especially if we're serious about addressing pervasive inequality. Last year's vital signs did show some upward trends when it came to air and water quality. And of course, during the pandemic, fewer cars are on the road, natural environments have had a chance to breathe, and there are early signs that CO2 emissions have decreased slightly. So what is sustainable? What will make the biggest impact? And how do we prioritize equality, both to bring a better quality of life to residents who've been living on the margins, but also get ourselves on a similar trajectory to other cities and countries where better levels of equality are delivering more environmental advancement? We're not going to be able to cover all aspects of this broad topic today, but we've gathered 4 thought leaders who will each shed some light on the environment and a greener, more equal recovery. I'll ask each panelist a couple of questions, and then we're going to have a roundtable discussion. And I invite anyone who has joined us today with questions to put them in the chat as soon as they come to you. Don't wait till the end, and we'll make sure we get to them in our Q&A section. So let's get into this. I'm going to start our discussion with Emmay Mah, Executive Director of the Toronto Environmental Alliance. Welcome, Emmay. It's so nice to see you. I want you to start with the work that Toronto Environmental Alliance did pre-COVID, and then give us a sense of what that looks like today.
Sure, thank you so much. It's great to be here. So the Toronto Environmental Alliance, or T as we call ourselves, has been around doing work in Toronto for over 30 years. We have 2 main issue areas that we focus on. One is waste and the other is climate. And just to give you a sense of what we were working on before COVID, in our waste portfolio, we really focus on city advocacy and trying to improve the city's waste diversion, including, improved organics diversion and also removing single-use plastics and other single-use items from the waste stream. We have community projects, including a zero-waste high-rise project, which looks at removing barriers that residents living in high-rises experience to waste diversion. So it might involve, for example, repurposing a garbage chute for organics and getting more people in the buildings involved. And that project's made a very successful transition to online support for our project buildings, including helping buildings to organize sessions for residents, in virtual forums and sharing learning among buildings. In terms of our climate portfolio, we've been really focused over the last couple of years in terms of shaping the city's climate strategy, Transform TO, and really making sure that climate action in Toronto has a strong equity focus. So we're bringing solutions that will really benefit communities and reduce barriers that people experience, which you've spoken about in your introductory remarks. And last fall, we worked with a number of environmental organizations and other organizations outside the environmental sector to call on the city to declare a climate emergency, which was centered on equitable climate action. So not only committing to getting on the path to zero carbon emissions by 2050 or by 2040 if we can, but also including tangible commitments to look at how we can bring in green jobs, decent work, and pathways to these jobs for equity-seeking groups and other folks. So we really feel that that kind of action in this COVID era, where the city's really experiencing some severe impacts and, like you said, disproportionate impacts, we need to continue that momentum. So we're very focused right now and working with other organizations on a green and just recovery that brings a lot of these same threads into that, but really looks at the decisions that the city makes and other levels of government around what investments happen in a recovery period. How, for example, do we invest in green infrastructure and green jobs that are going to address equity-seeking groups' need for employment creation and removing barriers that are going to improve housing, that's going to make very fundamental investments in transit. So, this work continues. We may all be in different situations around how we can do this work, but engaging residents in this kind of decision-making and making sure that community solutions are at the forefront remains incredibly important for T.
What concerns you most when it comes to the environment and the city during COVID?
Well, I think like all of us, we have really deep concerns around how the pandemic is highlighting inequity in our city. So we've looked at many differential impacts on seniors, for example, on folks that are in precarious job and housing situations. And we've also seen incredible responses coming, from community level, for example, mutual aid and support networks. And what that tells us is that we not only need to do systemic work to address this inequity, but we need to make sure that community responses are strengthened and supported by government, so that when we experience health shocks or environmental shocks, like we've talked about already, extreme weather, that residents who may be more vulnerable are supported, have those supports. So for example, seniors living in a multi-residential building in a heat wave, what kind of supports exist for them that can be accessed? How does that relate to the city's commitment to establish cooling centers that people can get to? So we want to really look at what we can learn during this time around what was working, important community response, but also where the gaps are and how those can connect to systemic inequity that you've spoken about. And so these are really big concerns for T. And this happens in the context of us, doing environmental work and also doing it in a way that connects to other social issues.
I love this idea of a green and just recovery. I think we're going to come back to that concept. Thank you so much, Emmay. I'm going to move to Tanya Chung-Tiam-Fook, the Senior Lead of Indigenous Engagement at Evergreen and Future Cities Canada. Thank you for joining us this morning, Tanya. Can you hear me okay? I know you were having, that's better.
Yes, thank you.
Why don't you start, Tanya, with a brief overview of your program's work pre-COVID and how it's shifted?
Sure. Of course, Evergreen has so many different amazing programs. I just lead a very humble kind of suite of them. But the two main spheres of Indigenous engagement and programming that I lead in collaboration with Indigenous partners and fellows for Evergreen and Future Cities Canada are the Indigenous Reimagining of Cities project and the Indigenous program for the Community Solutions Network. So the Indigenous Reimagining of Cities project is a platform for collaborative research, convenings, and land-based activations that are focused on Indigenous placekeeping, civic Indigenous partnerships, and our regional and national partnership-based activities work to advance the truth and reconciliation calls to action through writing relationships and championing Indigenous inclusion, leadership, unsettling and reimagining cities through Indigenous approaches to placekeeping and land stewardship. Our Community Solutions Network program is a Smart Cities Canada funded technology and innovation, capacity building and digital inclusion initiative that we've rolled out across 6 regions throughout Canada. And so in terms of the thought leadership that my programs lead, so collaborative research and publications, but also leading Evergreen's internal capacity development around reconciliation commitments, Indigenous inclusion and cultural competency. Those have not been affected that much because I can do a lot of it on my own and virtually, but definitely our convenings have had to pivot a lot since the start of the pandemic. So in terms of the placekeeping, reimagining of cities work, we're developing a series of fireside dialogues on Indigenous placekeeping, as well as a workshop on civic Indigenous partnerships and placekeeping. So the idea is to balance kind of place-based and inspired dialogue on site through the fireside dialogues, or at least in the Dawnlands region. The workshop will definitely be a virtual platform. And so balance as much as we can that place-based kind of dialogue, that inspiration by land and place that is so important to us as Indigenous peoples and our cultures, how we respond to place, how we create our expressions of place, and with protecting health and creating wide accessibility. We're also trying to continue to honor the multifaceted ways that Indigenous practitioners are channeling their respective values and worldviews through placekeeping methods, creations and activations. And the video productions of the dialogues, as well as the workshop, will be shared quite widely across our Future Cities channels, Evergreen network as well. And then the online workshop is meant to convene Indigenous and civic practitioners and thought leaders who are working in placekeeping, Indigenous leadership and reconciliation spaces, so that they can really come together and share strategies, learnings, recommendations, and best practices on how we can better activate and sustain truth and reconciliation calls to action and champion Indigenous and intercultural approaches to placekeeping. Just lastly, the Community Solutions Network, our national series of events, again, have had to pivot to a more online set of platforms and convenings. And so they will consist of smaller community-grounded opportunities for Indigenous, small and remote communities across the country to share collaborative learning, place-based expertise, matchmaking between communities and tech and innovation entrepreneurs or service providers, and really focus on the nexus between people, relationships, and the use of technology to build community capacity.
Thanks, Tanya. Can you give us a sense of how you think Indigenous communities are disproportionately affected by the climate crisis? And maybe, do you have a story you can share with us about that?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do have a story. So I think, when we talk about the effects of climate change and extreme weather, we definitely have to talk about climate justice and the reality that Indigenous and other marginalized, especially land-based peoples, tend to suffer a disproportionate level of the health, socioeconomic, livelihood, and infrastructural impacts vis-a-vis other communities in the country or globally. So in Canada, First Nations, Métis, Inuit communities are definitely, more vulnerable to the cumulative environmental impacts to health from both climate change, I would say, and industrial development. So some examples are risk to hunter and harvester safety on sea ice and winter roads, particularly in northern regions, coastal erosion, decreased wildlife populations, especially that wildlife that are used for game, flooding of rural and urban communities, damage to already very precarious housing structures, and then other health-related impacts like water and food insecurity, rise in NCDs like type 2 diabetes, and then of course increased mental health challenges across all of those impacts, especially due to increased isolation and disconnect from traditional pathways. And I think, you know, like the pandemic, climate challenges are what we tend to call threat multipliers, in that they amplify existing health and structural risks, inequities, and vulnerabilities in Indigenous communities. And as I just mentioned, we're definitely seeing that with the pandemic. In particular, the pandemic has increased isolation and food insecurity for remote and rural Indigenous communities, and really increased their dependency on e-services such as telehealth that require robust broadband infrastructure. And of course, that infrastructure and accessibility is quite limited in many regions, especially in the north and the west. An example is that so one set of communities that I worked with quite a bit, especially last year, were communities in Nunavut. So for Inuit harvesters across Nunavut, changes to sea ice cover and stability under climate change have made hunting and harvesting very dangerous, if not inaccessible altogether. So that's really intensified the territory's ongoing struggle with food insecurity, which is fueled, of course, by these harvesting challenges due to climate insecurity, but also economic constraints on families, and then also the lack of access to affordable and nutritious foods is also a driver of food insecurity. There's a lot of persistent hunger in children and youth across the region. So in Nunavut, despite there being no known COVID cases until very recently, schools and daycare centers were preventatively closed. And those schools and centers tend to provide breakfast and lunch programs for children and youth. So one thing that the government of Nunavut has done has partnered with an Inuit organization called Nunavut Chung-Tiam-Fook Incorporated. And so they're investing substantially into community-focused food programs so that Inuit families have access to good, nutritious food to be able to boost their immunity and to kind of, you know, help their health in general.
Thank you, Tanya. And I got a little gem from each of you with the threat multipliers. I want to talk about that. That's a really interesting way to look at the layers and the interconnectedness of the issues that that Indigenous people and others are facing through this pandemic. Thank you very much. We'll be back. Michael de Pencier. Michael is here wearing many hats, and one that isn't in my script, but I'm going to call out anyway, is also fund holder at Toronto Foundation. Only the second one we've had on our webinar series, and I'm so pleased to have Michael here. He's the lead director, Grand Trees Climate Solutions, and director for Trees for Urban Life Tree Coalition, as well as the Highway for Heroes tree campaign. I think Michael likes trees. And so Michael, I'll make sure you have your microphone turned on, because I can't hear the wind in the background there. And ask you to talk at a high level about the mission of the organizations I just highlighted your involvement with. Oh, Michael, I don't have audio.
Yeah. How's that?
That's
that audio?
better. You're good.
I'm in an east window with the sun shining in. If I fade, I hope it's the sun and not me. Anyway, thanks for your courage in including me this morning. I may be a relic of history, the very last old white dude to be invited to discuss the future. We guys had our chance and we blew it. Anyway, my basic message is to trust the kids and the scientists who tend to agree with each other that we should have at the top of the public agenda nature and protecting biodiversity and fighting the climate crisis. And these scientists confirm that planting trees, shrubs, bushes, pollinator plants in healthy biodiverse ecosystems is a great way to not only improve the health of the city, but also to deal with the climate emergency, which the Toronto Council have declared it to be a climate emergency. So we've been under one name or another following the mission of selling the virtues of trees to the public and raising money to plant them. And we've raised $10 million of an $11 million budget. The principal activity has been the Highway of Heroes tree tribute from Trenton to Keele Street. And we're planting there for Canada's soldiers who have died or served in the military through Canadian history. And this is not just sort of rows of trees. We have, for example, Abby Crowbrow is one of the unfortunate military people who died, 6 of them in a helicopter crash, and her Regal Road Public School at Dufferin and Davenport is getting 1 tree in memory of her. And out in Durham County, we're planting 3,598 trees, and landscape architect Scott Wentworth has devised the Vimy battlefield from the First World War, where 3,598 Canadians were killed. They all get a tree, and it's configured in a way that describes where everybody was and which brigade was in what formation in that battle, and the paths will be devised, and this could be quite a nice place to visit a few years from now. But it shows you the range of activities, and we have lots of kids coming out to plant. We're working with over 30 groups in Toronto to plant trees. Boy Scouts show up, and it's a community effort, and ageless and genderless and every other manifestation is out there helping, and it seems to have caught on with the city. We've got 700,000 trees have gone in this spring because planting seedlings can be done by one person. So, and it's outside, so there's very little risk to the people who have been doing the planting. I could say more. Hello?
Can you hear me okay? Oh, I've lost your sound, Michael. I'm gonna, maybe we'll,
How about now?
now I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. So here's my question. Tell us a story about why this work is so important right now.
Well, the scientists give us 10 years before we may have passed a point where where the planet can recover. So it's probably more important to plant trees in the tropics, but this is Toronto and we're here and we can do that. So I think it's sort of up to all of us to say, what can I do? We're offering the suggestion, if there are bigger things to do, like buy an electric vehicle, or take the subway, plant a tree, come on out and help us, bring your family. It's good for the health of our town. And we don't have a lot of time. Toronto used to be 40% canopy, and it's down to 27. And it's a few million trees to bring it back to the 40% of 50 years ago. But if we don't start now, we won't make it. And so I see an urgency get busy right now. And the community seems to be doing that, so it's very encouraging. Also, people get great ideas. There's two kids out in the Danforth Withrow School, Jasmine and Jet, 5 years ago at age 10 decided that we weren't doing enough for endangered animals, and they devised a kids run for nature. It's now managed by World Wildlife Fund, and they're up to 40 runs across Canada and have raised over $500,000 for habitat protection in Canada, just kids running once a year. So, you know, these innovations are encouraging. And I can't hear anybody.
It's okay, I'm back. I dropped off there for a moment, Michael. Thank you very much. I'm going to move to Steve Moran now. Steve is the National Coordinator of the Green Economy Network. Have I lost Aruna? Steve, can you hear me?
I can, yes. Welcome. Thank you very much for allowing me to join from unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory here in Gatineau, Quebec. I see Sharon has dropped off, so I'm just going to continue. I'm with the Green Economy Network, and we're an organization that was founded 12 years ago in the wake of the last economic crisis. The organization was created with the understanding that we needed collectively in Canada to counter the triple crisis that Canada and the rest of the world faces. There is an economic crisis in that our economy is poorly structured to respond to the challenges of our day. We have an environmental crisis, which now I think everybody recognizes as a climate crisis. And finally, there's an equity crisis in that those people who are most affected by climate change, by the other two crises, are actually not benefiting from, so far, the responses that need to come in order to restructure our economy and to address the climate crisis at the same time. So applying an equity lens is actually fundamental to making sure that our work to restructure our economy to fight climate is actually going to succeed. We've known this for decades, since the Brentwood Report in 1985. But certainly in the last 12 years, as my organization has found, we've actually lost a fair bit of time in fighting to take the measures we need. So the work that we do is to provide policy solutions at a national level, which are applicable at a provincial and, of course, municipal level as well, to help us address those crises. Now, for example, we put together a plan back in 2016 that talked about creating 1 million climate jobs. Now, that was forward-looking at the time. Right now, in this time of pandemic, that work has become even more important as we realize that we need to be able to create jobs that are going to address the climate crisis, that are going to be sustainable, that are going to actually address the inequities that we know, and that was mentioned earlier on with respect to Toronto specifically, and help us restructure our economy in a more lasting, sustainable way. I can't hear you, Sharon.
I keep getting kicked out, so I'm going to ask my question quickly, and you just keep talking until I show up again. How do you think the green economy can help cities like Toronto accelerate their recovery from COVID?
So Toronto is actually, amongst the municipal economies in Canada, one of the best situated, one of the most diverse economies. It is the most diverse, the most dynamic, and the largest municipal economy in the country. The pandemic has shown the capacity of governments and people collectively to actually face the challenges that we have. We need to take that understanding and move it toward the pandemic recovery to make sure that the recovery is just and it's equitable. Now, Toronto is in an excellent position to actually profit from that by becoming a world leader, certainly becoming the Canadian leader in rethinking the way our cities work that is climate friendly, that helps us position ourselves well for the next economy and addresses the equity challenges we have. So specifically, Toronto has over 1,000 towers that need to be renewed. The benefactors of doing that kind of renewal, we talked about tower renewal, which has been a big discussion in Toronto for a number of years. The big benefactors of that will be the people who get to do the work, but also the people who work in those buildings, who are often the most affected by the inequities that we face.
How difficult would it be to shift to a green economy, and how can we help you with that problem?
So difficulty, yeah, it's difficult to shift to a green economy, but it's going to happen because it has to happen. Putting forward, we work to put forward climate solutions that work nationally, that work provincially, that work municipally. So helping us in that would be great. We're trying to find Toronto-based solutions. I talked about tower renewal. I'll give you another one. One of the best ways to address the climate, equity, and economic crisis is to make sure that our transit systems work well, that they are electrified. And one of the challenges we have is right now, cities are strapped for cash, and making sure that the TTC and the other public transit systems in Toronto actually make it through, and make it through more strongly, is one of the best ways Toronto can help actually make sure we're ready to ensure a pandemic recovery that's just and green.
So how about we bring everybody together and have a bit of a roundtable chat before Q&As? We still have a bit of time where we can actually share our experiences with each other. I'm going to ask a question to the group, but maybe I'll ask Emmay to start, simply because we haven't heard from you since the top of the hour. And that question is this: tell us about the role of green space in benefiting both the environmental health of a city as well as the mental and physical health of its residents. I think there was such a big kerfuffle, rightly and wrongly, about the Trinity Bellwoods, the first day of summer, and folks trying to get out and get some fresh air. And I know this is a huge challenge with COVID, is the mental health issues of being stuck inside. So Emmay, I'll ask you to start.
Thanks, Sharon. Certainly, this is such a timely question in the context we're in with the pandemic. And this is where we see issues of, human well-being and environmental protection coming together. So what I could say from an environmental lens, our green infrastructure, including our parks and ravine systems, are really important in the extreme weather context. For example, if we're having high levels of precipitation and flooding, they support, managing, stormwater and that kind of thing. And then we're looking at the importance of human well-being and the role that green space can play in that. And people really demonstrating to us to maintain their well-being during this difficult time that they do need to be in green space and have access to it. And one thing that's really important to highlight is there isn't equal access around the city. You did highlight this in your presentation at the beginning. So for example, if you're a resident in a high-rise building, you don't have your own backyard to go to individually. So when we look at who has access and the importance of the city and other levels of government, contributing to green space, it just highlights that it's important for all of us, but it's important to really look at how that plays out in different neighborhoods and what we can do collectively to really emphasize that those investments need to reflect where there are gaps and people are not having access, including young people. And I just want to highlight that when young people seek out green space, when they don't have access to it in a backyard or something like that, we need to recognize that as a very fundamental need for their well-being, including their mental health. And we need to move forward as a city in a non-punitive way in terms of supporting those kinds of needs. And I think we have lost Sharon temporarily, but perhaps I can actually hand over to Tanya because you'd spoken about Indigenous land connections, and I think that's a really important theme when we're talking about green space and our natural world. So I'll hand over to you, Tanya.
Thank you, Emmay. You're a wonderful kind of co-facilitator with Sharon. Yeah, so I guess as someone who's dedicated my life and career to learning about and caring for our lands and waters and more than human kin around the city, and also someone who is really dependent on them, and I take a full acknowledgement of this for my, physical, emotional, spiritual, and mental well-being. I cannot emphasize enough how much urban ecosystems are the life givers and life sustainers in our cities. I think we've all, at least, in this space, have come to realize how much environmental and human health are interconnected. In particular, our human health and well-being is so dependent on healthy and biodiverse urban ecosystems. We need clean water, local foods, if they're available, natural medicines, recreation and ceremony, but also, as Emmay has referenced, climate resilient services such as mitigating heat island effect, the health impacts from heat waves in the city, stormwater and flood management. And as much as green spaces are like oases in the city, the conservationist in me, the land steward in me says that, they should not be islands or fragments of nature. We really need to have corridors, hopefully biological, natural corridors, connecting them, providing connectivity for wildlife and plant species, but also for people. And an example, a really great example from our city is our ravine systems in Toronto are tremendously important connective corridors. And just to highlight that Indigenous peoples in Toronto and settler cities throughout Canada have been acting as stewards of urban ecosystems for millennia, long before we called them cities or they were settled as cities. And just an example from, and kind of picking up what Emmay just spoke to in terms of, how fundamental it has been during the pandemic for people to be able to access green spaces around the city. But of course, they are not equally accessible to different social groups. But at Evergreen Brickworks, we have a beautiful campus on Treaty 13 lands that are filled with a network of Indigenous food and medicine gardens, children's and accessibility gardens, trails and ponds, gathering and ceremonial spaces. And during the pandemic, I have personally witnessed and heard from many colleagues, that we've seen a steady throng of visitors that, have continued to access our site, seeking respite, grounding, connecting to land, meditation, and definitely from some of the Indigenous partners that I work with around the city, they have continued also using our site and many other areas throughout the city that are available, as a source of healing and also instruction. We tend to go back to the land for teachings, to our natural laws, dependent on which nation. Each nation has their own kind of interpretation of natural laws, but these laws guide communities, guide knowledge keepers in how we should face and try to recover from crises like the pandemic.
Michael, Steve, other thoughts on environmental health of a city connected to mental and physical health?
Those are probably not even worth mentioning, but parks and ravines can be enjoyed independently of your income level. So they're, you know, a terrific asset for everybody in the community. And look at the green belt. One of the great achievements of Ontario, it seems to me, as long as we can protect it. It was a very good idea that presumably will only grow and become even more important. And 50 years from now, we'll be really, really glad we built the greenbelt or insisted on the greenbelt. And we networked our ravines, as Evergreen is doing, and protected our parks and added to our parks, which is one of our dreams at our organization. We're thinking if we can find the place, and we've got our eye on a couple of very big places, that maybe we build a brand new big park in Toronto and have it in tribute and welcome to all the people from all over the world who've come to make Toronto the world's most cosmopolitan city. And this would be their park for the people of Toronto. The new people emphasized.
Steve, you talked a lot about towers. How are they connected to this question?
Well, actually, I was going to go back to the question of green spaces, and I love Michael's idea of a big park in Toronto. I just wanted to take a different angle. I mean, we've talked about the well-being, which actually is absolutely vital, because building that well-being is important to building public support for climate solutions. But I was going to actually mention a report that's going to be coming out shortly in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy that highlights the importance, and this may seem out of, because we tend to think of green spaces as a nice to have, but they're actually going to highlight, this report is going to highlight the importance and the capacity that creating green spaces and investing in natural infrastructure can have on a knock-on effect on improving your economy. It's one of the best ways to actually improve your economy in a sustainable way. Now, they're identifying a number of things that are quick and a number of things that have very positive climate aspects. And one of the best ways to do is actually invest in green space. And that's, of course, of a premium in Toronto, where there is a dearth of green space. So the investment there is extraordinarily important for the economy and for the environment. But at the same time, like this and other policies that we need to bring in, they all have to be done through an equity lens to make sure that whatever investments are being made, it's baked in that they're actually going to be addressing equity challenge as well.
I have a couple of questions from the chat, and so I'll throw the first one out there. How can we better use our buildings and properties, including faith-based properties, across the city to help all people in this green revolution? Who would like to take a stab at that one?
So they could put electric sockets in all their parking lots to encourage electric vehicles. There's no bylaw at the moment that requires new buildings to do that. And there's no program I'm aware of to force existing buildings to get up to speed and offer electricity to their tenants' cars.
I can also jump in, Sharon. So T actually has a project with community hubs, looking at the role that community hubs can play in, mobilizing low carbon equitable neighborhoods. So we're working with the Bathurst Finch Unison Hub in North York, and we're working with the Parkdale Activity Recreation Center, but we're also in touch with folks that work with faith-based hubs. So what we're seeing, for example, in faith-based places is that those centers are being open to the community, and there's a strong interest in looking at how hubs, including faith-based hubs, can both, model, as Michael's suggesting, low carbon practices. So in the Bathurst Finch Unison Hub, like they really want to get a solar array on their custom built roof, which can host that. We've seen other faith-based buildings put solar arrays up. But there's also a role to be played around how they support equitable low carbon action that's being led by residents. And so, for example, in this time of COVID, hubs are supporting mutual aid networks. And those same mutual aid networks can be mobilized around, getting people excited about getting involved in local climate action, whether it's, climate-friendly gardens, but also supporting people in times of need around, we've talked about extreme heat and flooding. So there's definitely partners that T is engaged with, Faith in the Common Good, CREW, Creating Resilience to Extreme Weather, that are also working with different communities, including faith communities, around mobilizing this kind of action. And I think that's really exciting because it connects to what we've talked about, shared spaces. Hubs are shared spaces, and they're a tremendous resource for the city. And there's a lot more that we can do to leverage this resource for, low carbon equitable action. So it's really exciting.
I have a question, and maybe Tanya can go first on this one if she's comfortable. This from the chat: how can we bring different actors, including Indigenous communities, into the conversation about environment and equity, academics, businesses, etc.?
Yeah, yeah, this is something that's kind of been a career-long, interest of mine, and commitment wherever I work is, how can we make sure that Indigenous actors are, front and center in all these different conversations, around urban planning and land use, conservation, land stewardship, planning and design, you name it. And, particularly where these decisions impact Indigenous communities. And I think a lot of people tend to think about Indigenous communities, being on reserve or in rural and remote areas of the country. And that is true in some effect. But, the majority of Indigenous peoples in Canada live in cities. And so, we really need to make sure in our organizations and processes that we really work to engage Indigenous actors. And so, having worked in government, in academia, in the nonprofit sector, as well as at the community level, there are opportunities always, and there are Indigenous peoples who are, actively involved in all of these spaces, and have so much to share and say. And, some are already very much involved and taking a lot of leadership and, continue more and more to do so. But I think there's still a lot of spaces where, whether it's oversight or just not enough consciousness has been invested or put into thinking about who is being invited to the table. I think that's really important to, that, and also when Indigenous people are invited into these spaces, and where the decisions are very much affecting Indigenous communities, whether urban or rural, where, the impacts are quite strong, Indigenous people should be, as far as I am concerned, kind of in the inner circle in terms of the expertise, the experiences, the unique perspectives that they share in these dialogues and in these decision-making processes. So, so not just, kind of symbolically brought in later, like downstream, in a project or in a process, but, from the very inception, if possible, and really kind of prioritizing Indigenous expertise in those conversations.
Thank you, Tanya. And I want to get one last question in here because it's a big one, and I'm sure there will be opinions on this. Michael mentioned the Greenbelt and what a legacy that will be. And but there is an elephant in the room, and this question comes from one of our folks in the room asking about the elephant, which is a provincial government that so far has not seemed to be really environmentally focused. In fact, seems to be pulling back on certain things. How are you all managing through that? How do we all manage at this time? And have you had any successes to share? Did I just toss a hot potato out there? Who wants
I can
to?
take on this one a little bit.
We've all got our hands out to the provincial government, hoping like hell that they'll break form.
Steve.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is a core of the work that we do is around garnering or finding political support for the climate solutions that we need to create. And this goes back to the previous question as well, is one of the reasons why political support doesn't come through when elections come is that a lot of people see the just transition that needs to happen in the economy as a threat to their own well-being. And I think that explains to a great extent this political success of what we can call an anti-climate policy. So what we have to make sure is that people who are the most affected by the climate crisis itself, but also by the solutions, are actually at the table helping us make decisions so they can see themselves as winners. The federal government had a task force on the just transition. And one of the things they said, you have to make sure that the people most affected by the solutions are actually at the table, their communities, and also the people that are surround them, to make sure that they are seeing climate action as a win. We know that's the case. These people on this call know that's the case, but the broader public doesn't know it. So we have to find local solutions that actually demonstrate that. I can give you a great example. People who work on diesel engines in the transit system are often seeing the bringing in of electric buses as a threat to their well-being. So we actually have to help them find the way from the job that they have now in a sustainable way to the job that they're going to have in the future, that actually makes sure that they become champions for that change rather than becoming victims of it. Having them at the table is an extraordinarily big part of that.
I wish we could talk and talk and talk and talk. This is such a big subject. I want to thank Emmay, Tanya, Michael, and Steve for taking time out of your full schedules to be with us this morning. I could do 3 more episodes on environment and inequality and the interconnectedness of it. I hope that our folks that have joined us today have felt this is as interesting and meaningful at this time as we have. I am, I mentioned that this was our 9th webinar in the Better Toronto Coalition series. We hosted our first session early on in this crisis, and we were able to do so thanks to the Van City Investment Bank. They made a financial investment into the Better Toronto Coalition. They helped us with this technological platform, and we're so grateful. Leith Wheeler has just come on board with the latest corporate donation to our Better Toronto Coalition Fund. Thank you for the $10,000. And the total that we've been able to distribute over these last 3 months is $3.3 million. And that is all in unrestricted gifts to organizations that we believe in and support, and that are working on the intractable problems through this COVID time. That's 183 grants to date. Ultimately, that's why we're gathered here, really to understand these issues and act on them. And I'm just so proud of the team and so grateful to them for all their hard work, juggling their families, their children, their parents. Some of my staff live on their own. It's been a really challenging time, and I'm so proud of the work they've been able to do on this Better Toronto Coalition for the last 3 months. We have one more webinar coming up before we take a short break over the summer to regroup. And actually, I'm thinking of your green and just recovery, Emmay, in when I think of what we want to talk about starting in the fall. Thursday, June 25th, the conversation will focus exclusively on Indigenous Toronto. I know Tanya will be happy to hear that. It's the same week as National Aboriginal Day, and many of us want to do more when it comes to reconciliation. This is actually a question we get from our fund holders all the time. And so please join us next week because it will give you a lot more ideas and actions that you can take to support that work. We're partnering with the Toronto Aboriginal Support Services Council and 4 of their member agencies. And I will be stepping out of this chair and happily giving it over to Task's Executive Director, Lindsay Kretschmer. She will be the moderator next week, and she'll do a great job. Lindsay's fantastic. So please tune in. These discussions are so important. I know you're here because you care about your communities and you want to connect with others who do. And I hope you find some hope and some inspiration in what is a very challenging time. So once again, thank you to our guests. Thank you to those who joined us this morning. And we'll see you in 2 weeks to talk more. Take care, stay healthy.
Thank you.
Thanks all.